Thank you. Thank you very much. It's an honor for me to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And I have about 45 minutes to make the case why authentic leadership really matters. I should start off by telling you that I actually live in New Zealand. I am a New Zealander. Sometimes when I give presentations and I go to leave, people say, have a nice trip back to the US. I'm home. I came to New Zealand in 2003 to work with Fonterra on the initial executive team with Fonterra. I thought for what would be a 3-year stint in New Zealand. I had never lived outside the US. I had worked for global companies, Amico and Prudential Financial. But in 2003, I got a call from an Australian headhunter calling on behalf of a brand new co-op in New Zealand. I didn't know what a co-op was at the time. A dairy co-op. I'd never been on a farm before. So I was already sort of batting zero in that regard there. But I came over to interview with Craig Norgate and the initial team at Fonterra. And I tell you what, it was a very compelling proposition. I had never worked for an organization that had such intricate impact on the economic viability of a nation before. We often talk about the importance of line of sight when we go to work each morning, when we walk through the door. Do we believe that we are contributing to something big and something important? Is it bigger than a paycheck when we talk about this whole notion of line of sight? And I just found the whole proposition of being able to come and work for an organization in a nation where the impact was so tangible and just so, just incredibly real. And I came over for what I thought would be 3 years. And it only took me about 2 years in New Zealand to realize that I was in no rush to get back to Manhattan. It's interesting. You spend most of your life sort of tracking towards an aspiration. I had, my goal as I was growing up as a kid, I grew up in Washington, D.C., and my aspiration had always been to live and work in New York City. And I had been there for 4 years, and then I get this call, and lo and behold, here I am 15 years later. I've become a citizen. I became a New Zealand citizen in 2008. I wanted to take the full plunge. I just didn't want to sort of dance around the edges there. New Zealand has helped me become a whole person, and I'll put some context around that. I talk a lot about the importance of authentic leadership. And I come from a very personal perspective on that, which I will share with you. But I do believe that authentic leadership matters, and matters more now than ever before. We've come into this realm of emotional intelligence when we talk about leadership and leadership effectiveness, this notion of EQ. If we look back 30 years ago, you often progressed to the seats that you're in on the basis of your technical knowledge, or what we would call sort of your smarts, what we would label sort of IQ if we looked at two buckets, IQ and EQ. And 30 years ago, we didn't talk a whole lot about emotional intelligence. We didn't have any empirical data that set under the importance of what it means to be emotionally intelligent, particularly in this realm of leadership. The cycles of change have compressed significantly in organizations compared to just 15 years ago. The cycles of change have compressed threefold, essentially. We used to be able to, when we nailed something down, when we initiated a new process, a new system, a new strategy, we had the luxury of about 7 years on average to be able to sort of bolt it in place and get it stabilized. So a lot of what we did was more in that realm of management, where we had the luxury of a long sort of lifeline, if we would, to sort of get things nailed down and have them perfect. Change happens roughly every 18 months now in 2018 compared to 15 years ago. So it's impossible to have everything nailed down. There's also more vulnerability swirling around in organizations. People still have a lot of people still have sort of a negative mental model or a negative frame around change, and so change is scary for a lot of folks. I entered the business world in my late 30s, and I was one of those managers who used to be afraid of change because it initiated a lot of angst and anxiety and that sense of vulnerability. So I loved the ability to be able to hide behind process. Process was my friend when I was a young manager because I just didn't like the notion that there was not much that I could do about the angst and the vulnerability that people felt, sort of that notion of uncertainty and those types of things that come along with change. And I realized that I wasn't doing myself any favors, and I certainly wasn't doing any favors for the people that I worked with, hiding behind process, sort of the shield of process. I used to love it when we were scripted and taking people through change, where on October the 15th, we could have this conversation with them, and we could only say that much. And then we would go back behind the shield and then come back out like 20 days later, and we could have another conversation with them that was carefully scripted. And then we'd get back behind the shield and go into this void. And I realized that that's not leadership, that's sort of that's what we used to refer to as change management, where we manage people through change, through a series of processes, and they get to the other side of a change initiative, and then we wonder why engagement is down, why it is that levels of trust have gone down because we've stopped connecting with people. We don't have the luxury in 2018 to get things nailed down before we have to pick them up again. So it requires you to be reasonably comfortable with this whole notion of vulnerability. Vulnerability is just that idea that everything cannot be perfect. If you're a person who requires everything to be perfect, then you're going to have your hands on everything, and it's going to drive you insane in 2018 because it's just basically impossible. So are you able to inspire? Are you able to empower? Are you able to invigorate a degree of engagement in people who need you to be there to sort of give them that sense of optimism, invigorate them, to inspire them, to be yourself, not to be this perfect person, this manager that is cloaked in process, but to come out from behind process, come out from behind the shield, and have honest conversations with your teams, to have conversations about change and to connect with them in a way that doesn't necessarily convey that everything is nailed down before we can move on, but that there is just the idea that you need people, that it's important, that you actually need people to help you be successful. The realm of authenticity is an important one for me. I wrote the book, The Imposter Syndrome, in 2013. I've been behind that mask a time or two in my life. I wrote the book because there's this common notion that imposter syndrome is something that I must be experiencing, particularly when you go through it, the idea that I must be the only one, when in fact, if you look at the research on imposter syndrome, roughly 75% of you all sitting in this room probably have experienced this at one point or another in your professional career. It usually happens to people who are in stretch. So moving from one role into a bigger role where somebody taps you on the shoulder and says, hey, I think that you're ready to step into a bigger role with broader span. And you are not inclined to turn that type of opportunity down. But then very often an inner critic, I call it the voice of the inner critic, which basically goes, am I qualified for this? Will I do okay? Maybe I shouldn't take it, those types of things. And I wanted to normalize imposter syndrome. I've been behind that mask. I was behind that mask when I came to New Zealand. I came I was the chief learning officer at Prudential Financial. I had worked in some wonderful roles leading up to my migration to New Zealand, and I was brought over to just bring some expertise in talent management in particular. And I remember dropping down at the table, my first day at the executive team table at Fonterra. This was back in the early days where we had some noble giants in dairy sitting around that table from the amalgamation. And I remember thinking, oh my goodness gracious, what am I doing here? Am I going to be able to contribute anything? I don't know anything about dairy. Maybe I should keep my mouth shut. Maybe I shouldn't contribute in those types of things. Imposter syndrome is pretty common, pretty prevalent. And so I wrote the book to basically normalize it and make it give people an opportunity to actually talk about it in organizations? Do we encourage people to be themselves and to bring their perspective without putting a lot of pressure on themselves to be perfect people? I followed in 2015 with the book Fitting In, Standing Out, Finding Your Authentic Voice at Work. And in that book, I talked about the inherent tension between fitting in, when we voluntarily raise our hand to join an organization. We are implicitly buying into the social order that we're about to walk into. We walk into an organization, and very quickly we find that the social order will require us to adapt the way we are sometimes, significantly, to the point where we find ourselves sort of turning down the volume on our perspective or switching to a frequency in terms of how I need to be that doesn't necessarily resonate with how I want to be in terms of an authentic person. And sometimes we fit in so well that we put ourselves on mute. There are some organizations that, not necessarily written explicitly, but the social order requires you to get in here and get in here fast, get in here quickly, and preferably quietly. So even though sometimes in an interview you are told, we like the way you think, your perspective is rich, that's some really great questions that you're answering. We need to get you in here as quickly as possible. We need you to get in here, and we need you to disturb the peace and shake things up and bring that voice. You ever been told that? Get in here and shake things up. And you walk in the door, and immediately people are reaching for your volume button in terms of that calibration, to the point that sometimes we pride ourselves on having quiet teams. We can get a lot done if the team is quiet. We don't have to have as much conversation, much debate. We can just move things along. So there are some leaders that pride themselves on being able to turn the volume down on perspective and the unique contribution that people bring. At the other end of the continuum is standing out, where sometimes people have a difficult time making their way in. There's two ends of the continuum. Fitting in, where I turn my voice off to the point where I'm no longer having impact, and standing out sometimes if I can't fit in, to the point where at either end of the continuum, my perspective is irrelevant. I'm not having input. I'm not having impact the way that I want. So the realm of authenticity, very, very important to me. This dates back to my childhood. So I just want to tell you all, give you all a sense of my personal story, which would have been, I'm 63 now, and I sometimes marvel at being able to stand on the stage and tell this story, because when I was 20, and if you had asked me would I ever dare tell you the story that I'm about to tell you, I would have told you you were absolutely crazy. I grew up as a gay kid who I hated being gay as a kid. I just absolutely hated it. As a young kid, there was something. I grew up, born in 1955. I came of age right in the mid-'60s or so. I grew up in a community where gay people just were not. There was a low tolerance for gay folks, and so I deduced very quickly that it just wasn't safe. There were kids in my neighborhood, older kids than me, who were outwardly gay and who were it's called brutalized, beaten up. I just couldn't understand what it was about me that would cause ire and consternation and anger and frustration in so many people. Kids are very intuitive. I knew when I was 11 or 12 that I was gay. I certainly did by the time I was 13 or 14. But I also realized that there was something about me that disturbed the peace. I just didn't like disturbing the peace. I didn't like the idea that I was something that caused other people to be uncomfortable. When I grew up in elementary school, in primary school, we had a grade on our report card, we had this, it was called citizenship. There was math, there was science, there was geography, there was citizenship. And citizenship was how you conducted yourself, how well behaved you were. And I prided myself on getting an A in citizenship. My mental model about not disturbing the peace started when I was a little kid because I liked to get an A in citizenship. Those kids who were quiet, those kids who were obedient, those kids who spoke only when spoken to, who otherwise remained quiet and was just really obedient. And that was really important to me. I liked being the obedient kid. So the notion of disturbing the peace was absolutely incongruent with what I considered to be a good citizen, my notion at 7 years old in the second grade of being a good citizen. There was a kid who it was in my class. His name was Wendell. Wendell Fitzgerald was his name. And Wendell was a noisy kid. He was just noisy. You had any noisy kids in your life? He was just he couldn't sit still. Wendell would ask a lot of questions in class. He would always raise his hand. He was always raising his hand, and he was inquisitive. I didn't know what it was called then. Now, as an adult, it's called divergent thinking, and that is that some of us are wired to be divergent thinkers, where we push our thinking out through inquiry, so we're more naturally inquisitive. I think Wendell was a divergent thinker, and that this was a kid who he used to get whacked all the time, just paddled. This was back in the days when you could actually paddle kids. And Wendell, he wasn't a bad kid. He wasn't disrespectful. He was just inquisitive. He was just noisy. Wendell just was not afraid to ask why. And that brought him a lot of consternation. It really did. He would come back from the principal's office, and we would say to Wendell, "Why don't you just be quiet? Why do you do this to yourself? Why don't you just sit quietly and be a good citizen? You'll get an A in citizenship, Wendell, if you just stop asking so many questions." But Wendell couldn't help himself. He was just naturally inquisitive. I never really tracked to see what happened with Wendell in his life, but it always stuck with, because I took those mental models of being a kid who prided himself on keeping things peaceful, and I took that into adulthood. So when I realized that I was gay, I thought that it was really, the requisite was on me to be able to turn down the volume on my persona in order not to disturb the peace. Heck, I grew up in church where, sermons in church where I would hear about the evils of homosexuality, that it was a sin. Like many African Americans, I grew up in church. I was in church every Sunday. Church was important to me. God was important to me. And I'm trying to reconcile in my 12-year-old brain this notion that I'm offensive to God. That's a hard thing to get your head around when you're 12 years old, when you want to love God, but you're very concerned that there's something about you that's offending God. I mean, that's deep stuff. And so I learned, just like a lot of people in my generation, that the best thing to do would be to turn down the volume on that. Just sort of put it on hold. Just put it on mute. That I deduced from family gatherings and social events that people were just a lot more comfortable when I showed up with a girl. Just a lot more comfortable. The anxiety went down. I mean, kids are intuitive, and so you walk into a room, you're 16 years old, and you walk into a room with a girl, and everybody goes, a sigh of relief. It's sort of like you don't need a rocket scientist to be able to tell you that there's a correlation between you giving people what they need to see and your own sense of again, being a good citizen. So I decided when I was in my late teens that I would live a closeted lifestyle. I just thought it was something that you could put on hold. It was the 60s. It was the big movement in the States, social reform, civil rights, etc. I was black and gay. I couldn't do anything about being black. That I had to deal with. But being gay, I thought, okay, I could put a mute button on that one and just hold off. I didn't want to bear two crosses. At that age, and so I gave people what I thought they needed. I gave people what I thought they wanted. I thought people wanted me to be straight. I thought people wanted me to be this sort of the representation of the iconic, perfect citizen, if you will. I met a wonderful woman, Kim. We met in church, as a matter of fact. And we married when I was 24. And I just decided that being gay was something that it was a sort of option in my life, and that I could continue to sort of pray it away, was my strategy back then. Kim and I had 2 daughters, Leslie and Alexis. My daughters are 36 and 34 now. I'm telling you the story, not that I would change anything in it. I love my daughters. I love my grandsons. I have 2 grandsons, Churchill, who is 6, and Dean, who is 3. They're coming to New Zealand for the first time for Christmas to spend Christmas with Poppy here in New Zealand. I wouldn't change a thing about my story, but I tell my story to make the case that you can go to a very unhealthy place sometimes if you aren't comfortable with who you are. We married. I got my PhD in clinical psychology. I wanted to be a psychologist. I went to work in a mental health system in Indiana. I worked in that system for 3 years, and I decided that I wanted to be a manager. I wanted to be a manager. The managers in the system were, they had better offices. They were, they weren't seeing, I was seeing like 18 patients a day in my realm. The managers were seeing like 7 or 8, and they were managing the rest of us. And I just wanted a piece of that. Wanted to get a feel for what that was all about. And a number of people, so I looked at options, and a number of people said, Harold, you have your PhD. There's a critical shortage of medical service officers in the U.S. Armed Forces, the 3 branches of the military. And so why don't you consider that? Why don't you consider actually going into the U.S. military, one of the branches? You can get some management experience as an officer. You can run a clinic, and then you can get out after 3 years and go back into the mental health system and be a manager. So that's what I did. Look, I knew that it was illegal to be gay in the U.S. military in 1986. But that wasn't an issue for me because I wasn't gay. So I went through the process and went through the application process, went through the selection committee, and went down to Indiana, went down to Indianapolis to meet with Captain Simpson, who was the recruiter, and sitting there, and I'm filling out the application, and this was question 13 on the application to become an officer in the U.S. military. Question 13. Who would have imagined that on a job application? Imagine that question on a job application in the year 2018. Clearly, there's a right or wrong answer up there. There was actually a box that said, if yes, please provide details. That wasn't going to go down. I ticked no, but it always stands out for me because I had denied being gay all my life. Oh, I had been poked and poked and poked from, as a kid growing up, just poked and poked and poked. But I got good at denying that I was gay. That wasn't the issue. The issue was, for the very first time in my life, I was being asked to check a box to officially deny who I was. And I tell you what, that stayed with me. I'd never been asked before to sign away my integrity with my signature under that. So that, it was a reckoning, but I figured I could hold my nose for 3 years, go in and really, make something out of this. I loved every part of being an officer. I loved everything about being an officer. I didn't anticipate that this whole notion of leadership would resonate with me so well. I took it seriously. I learned about the Air Force. I learned about the wing. I went out across the base. I didn't want to be like Hawkeye and MASH on that show MASH, the medical service officers. Not at all. I was a real officer, and I wanted to convey that. And so I steeped myself deep in knowledge around the Air Force, the wing that I was assigned to. And in 1988, I did something that no other medical service officer had done at Myrtle Beach Air Force Base. I won Company Grade Officer of the Year, which I really took great pride in because I invested a lot. I really wanted to just really immerse myself fully in the experience. Be careful when you lie about who you are, because it will take you into the eye of a storm. And little did I know that award would then prompt the chief psychologist in the U.S. Air Force to call me up about 2 weeks later and say to me, Captain Hillman, we realized that you were going to get out after 3 years, but we'd like to extend an invitation for you to come teach at the U.S. Air Force Academy for 4 years, which will mean that you'll put on the rank of major and extend your tour. And Kim and I talked about it and decided, let's do it. Let's go for it. Be careful when you lie about who you are. It will take you deeper into the eye of the storm. Off I went to the academy. I loved it. Teaching leadership now. 4,000 cadets, all who were going to be officers, roughly around the age of 22 or 23. We didn't use the word management in the Air Force. That wasn't a word. It wasn't in our lexicon. Leadership was what we talked about. And I loved every bit of it. I immersed myself fully and deeply in it. And in 1992, I won Outstanding Military Educator at the U.S. Air Force Academy. And I tell you this to basically make the point that on the outside, I was doing well, by all accounts, in terms of sort of recognition for a job well done. Again, immersing myself fully into the role of an officer, which I really loved. Well, wouldn't you know it, in 1992, Bill Clinton was elected president of the United States, and like all the Democratic Party's candidates in 1992 who ran for president, they ran on the vow that if elected, they would remove the ban on gay people being able to serve openly in the U.S. military. That ban had been in place for decades, been in place forever, basically. Prior to World War II, it had been illegal to be gay in the U.S. military, so you were imprisoned for 3 years if you were outed as a gay soldier. Prior to that, after World War II, it became a psychiatric disorder in line with the American psychiatric. Prior to 1973, homosexuality was a psychiatric disorder. Not sure if many of you all realize that, and it wasn't until 1973 when the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality as a psychiatric disorder. So then, there went the military's last bastion of hope. They could no longer criminalize gay people. They could no longer discharge them as being psychiatrically ill. So then the argument was that somehow gay people serving with straight people is going to ruin the morale and the esprit of the troops. And the American public had had enough of that, basically, and had started to put a bit more heat and pressure on the military to open its thinking a bit more. And so when Bill Clinton was elected, he formed this commission led by Secretary of Defense Colin Powell. This was commissioned in January of 1993. And that's when General Hosmer at the Air Force Academy called me into his office and said, Captain Hillman, congratulations. Because of your outstanding service, we're sending you to Washington, D.C. to serve on the commission to determine if gay people can serve openly in the United States military. And there I went. There I went. There I went. I was the real deal. I was the imposter. I was behind that mask. I mean, we were sequestered in Georgetown for 3 months. We were in civilian attire. It was all very hush-hush, secretive. And heck, the very first day I showed up, I was convinced I'd have to walk through a scanner. You know, that they were going to make us walk through a scanner that would start beeping. I tell you what, it was the most confronting experience ever. We were told on the second day by the 3 generals and the admiral who chaired the panel that, and what they said to us was, ladies and gentlemen, there were 44 guys and 3 women, and they said to us, this ban is not going to be removed under our watch, and we need to make that clear right away. So I knew within 2 days that I was about to participate in a process that was going to be a sham of a consultative process where pro-gay and anti-gay groups came in to petition the committee to make their case about why people like me should or shouldn't be able to serve openly, and I'm sitting there ostensibly as a straight officer going through this process. I heard it all. I heard it all. It was very confronting to hear people come in and present research about gay people ruining the esprit de corps, still being, forget what the APA says, it's still a psychiatric illness. They came in with studies around genetic deficiencies. They came in with they hit it from every angle. And there I sat, sitting there, perpetuating the mythology of people who, just perpetuating the mythology through my silence. When pro-gay groups came in, the generals and the admiral made a point of putting a bowl of fruit on the table in front of them, a symbolic gesture there, just a joke for all of us sitting around the table there. Fruit for the fruits was the gesture there. And that bowl of fruit wasn't lost on me as I sat there watching openly gay people come in and make the case for why folks like me should be able to serve. And I sat there perpetuating the mythology through my silence. Silence is not golden sometimes. Sometimes silence actually perpetuates the mythology that keeps us more narrowly focused. One pro-gay group came in and made the case. They said, respectfully, sirs, roughly 13 to 18% of your military is already gay. So, it's not like it's not like our starting point is from zero here, so let's be real about this. And after they left, the admiral, I'll never forget this, the admiral pounded the table. He was furious because there had been groups who had come in before to make the case. This is not, there's already gay people in the military. And the admiral after they left, he stood up and he pounded the table. He pounded it hard. And he said, look, I'm tired of hearing these statistics, these stats that they keep coming into. He said, I've been in the military for 35 years, and I can tell you that I have never met anyone gay in the military. That's what the admiral said. And I was just sitting right there. And I just, those 15 minutes of fame that you fantasize in your head, what would you do if you could play it back over again? And I just wanted to stand up and go, well, girlfriend, this is your lucky day. But I didn't. I was a good citizen. I prided myself on getting an A in citizenship. My role was to sit quietly. Eventually, the end result of that commission was don't ask, don't tell. Don't ask, don't tell, don't pursue. I felt like shit at the end of that. I had gone through a 3-month process, and I contributed to a decision that in some cases was probably worse than the ban itself, because the policy was now, okay, we're going to call off the witch hunts, and we're not going to have these, big exercises to out gay people in the military anymore. So if you're gay in the military, it's okay to be gay as long as you don't tell anyone you're gay. You can be gay as long as you aren't gay. That was the policy. And I thought, what have I done? What have I contributed to? In terms of this outstanding service and these decorations and those types of things, when we all got back to our bases, we were all awarded the Meritorious Service Medal for outstanding service to the United States. It's a big deal in the military to get a medal. There's no bonuses, there's no discretionary funds and those types of things. A medal is everything. To have 1,000 of your peers pull together in an auditorium to have that medal pinned on me. And I tell you what, that was the most confronting day of my life, as I stood there on that stage with General Hosmer pinning that medal on my uniform. As I said, I grew up in church. Scripture is very important to me, and a scripture resonated with me that day on the stage. For what shall it profit you to gain the whole world and yet lose your own soul? Is there anything worth more than your soul? And it was on that day that I decided that I had gone too far in terms of fitting in, that I had lost the plot, that I had lost perspective on what was required to be a good citizen. And that's when I decided that I needed to become a whole person. 2 days later, I had a conversation with Kim in what was the most sort of daunting conversation that I'll ever have with another human being. She's a lovely woman. We are still wonderful friends, and she handled it so well, loving me. My biggest fear was that for me to be real with other people would cause disconnect. And what I realized in the moment was that when you give people your whole self, the essence of connection is actually enhanced. A day later, I went in and talked to my commander, Colonel Buron, a fighter pilot in the U.S. Air Force, and sat down with him and said, "Sir, I cannot stay in an organization that will not allow me to be myself." And Colonel Buron said to me, "Captain Hillman, why do you think I sent you to serve on the commission?" I think there were some things that you needed to just sort of get across in that respect there. People who I thought would turn actually connected. It is an important thing because I just make the point that once I let go of that fear that I was not going to be acceptable to people and actually just gave them who I was able to enhance connection. I could feel it viscerally. We lose the plot sometimes going inside the tent, whether it be the military, whether it be your company, whether it be any organization where we go in. There's a social order that sometimes requires us to turn the volume down or the perspective on who we are. I make the case in Fitting In, Standing Out, the book, that fitting in, there's a stronger gravitational pull to fitting in. I can tell you, I've heard so many stories of people who have gone to that other end of the continuum there. A guy who I worked with at Fonterra, he's in his 60s now, but when he was in his 40s and he was in a sales role, his boss told him not to laugh. "I don't like the way you laugh." My friend Brent has a snort attached to his laugh. So it is a bit of it, but it's his laugh. Try to rewire a laugh. And Brent tells the story that Brent just tells the story that he considered himself to be of reasonably high self-esteem, and yet he stopped laughing for an entire year because his boss required him not to. He said, is off-putting to customers and those types of things. A woman who was told that she's too perky, and that was the word that was used. She joined the team. A week later, her boss pulled her in and said to her, "Look, we're rather quiet here in the office. She's extroverted, she's electric. We're rather quiet here in the office. And we're finding that if you could just be a bit quieter, that would be helpful to us." And so she sat at her desk the following week for 4 days and then finally had a conversation with her boss and said, "I can't do this. I've got to be able to bring myself and my perspective." A woman in the Air Force, in the New Zealand Air Force, whose commander told her, "Take the pictures of your kids down. It defies the warrior image that we want here in this squadron." We fly humanitarian missions in New Zealand. So this whole notion around defying the war, there's nothing in the handbook that says you can't have your kids' pictures up. She took the pictures down. We have people ultimately, the ultimate story is a friend of mine, and he's now in his 60s, but when he was 19, working for a food processing plant, where he chipped a piece of his index finger, sliced it, and bleeding profusely, and his boss took him to the A&E and told him when he got out of the car, "It happened at home." And he went in, he was 19, and he went in and told them that it happened at home because the team needed you to be quiet. He couldn't sleep for a year. He just said he just tossed and turned for an entire year. When you get to that point where the team needs you to be quiet in order to be a good citizen, your conscience will wake you up in the middle of the night. It will not let you sleep. There is unfinished business when you turn off your perspective and stop bringing it. And so I talk about the importance of standing out and really being able to bring your voice and your perspective, and that those of you who are leaders here in the audience today have a role to play in making it okay for people to be able to stand out and to be able to bring their voice and their perspective, one conversation at a time, which makes a huge difference in people being engaged and being able to shift the conversation in the direction of the team where it needs to be. Authenticity is real. I did over 200 interviews for the second book. And if you want to get the essence of what people are talking about when they are talking about an authentic person, there are 7 elements. The first one is positivity. Positivity. When you think about an authentic person, this is a person who typically makes you feel good about yourself. If that person doesn't need to be perfect, it means that they don't have a problem then letting you help. The problem with perfectionism is that the message that you send to people is that your help is optional. And the one thing that people love about an authentic person, particularly if they are a leader, is that their title or their rank or their role doesn't get in the way of them being able to tap the experience and the perspective of other people. When you're going through imposter syndrome, it's hard to ask other people to help you because you think of that as a sign of weakness as opposed to a positive thing. Are you positive enough? Do you affirm people? There's a human need to be needed. So do you affirm people for coming through the door each day and wanting to make a big difference in the work that they do? Sometimes we get overly focused on the negative, where we're just finding errors and mistakes and finding fault. And before you know it, when you walk towards people, if you are a team leader, they begin to close off. They begin to put a protective shield up because all they associate you with is sort of negativity. So this notion of positivity is just affirming people and fueling people. When I did interviews with people about what they considered to be the traits of an authentic person, this one came up time and time again. This is a person who just makes me feel good about myself. This is a person who affirms the fact that I come through the door each day wanting to make a difference and that I can do so. So this positivity, do you fuel people when it matters the most? Are you real? Are you real? Are you consistent? That's really what this is about. Are you the same person over here as you are over here as you are over here? We don't like incongruence in people. And in these interviews, when asking people to delineate what they consider to be the traits of an authentic person, this one came up quite often. And that is a person who just is real. They don't have to use 18-letter words, and the higher you get in rank, the more important you have to sound. And a good friend of mine, he's a senior executive, and he told me that he was giving a speech. This was a few months ago, and he was giving a speech on the company vision, and he was up on stage, and he was using words that he didn't even, are you connecting with people in terms of what's real? Or do people need a decoder to figure you out? So authentic people just bring it, and they bring it in a consistent and a genuine way. Do you have edge? This really stands out for folks. Do you have edge, that ability to stand out and bring it? Sometimes that edge is aesthetic in terms of you can actually see it, so a person who is just particularly colorful. But you can be the most introverted person on the team, but when it matters, do you actually bring it? Do people know where your lines in the sand are, where you are likely to hold firm around something that you really believe in? It is quite compelling for people when you bring it, when you stand out. It actually encourages other people to be able to do the same. Vulnerability, the number one component that came up in the interviews there. That notion of, am I okay with taking risk? Do I have to be perfect? Can I take myself out of my comfort zone? Can I stretch myself? If you're going to ask your team to stretch themselves, then you've got to be willing to do the same thing. So this idea of not having to be perfect, not always having to be right, not always having to be the definitive last voice on everything, but again, letting people help you. You're more likely to enhance connection with other people by needing them. You've got to have a good, healthy relationship with vulnerability. That image there depicts what it's like when two people are connected, and that is that we don't have to be threatened by each other's titles or experience, but that there is this idea around energy, the idea that I am really building something with someone else. Leaders put pressure on themselves to be the answer man or woman. Do you let people help you think? Do you invite your peers in? Toss perspective around. Give people an opportunity to help you be successful, which is really the sort of the critical defining criteria around vulnerability. There is this notion around integrity. I don't need to make a case. I typically don't have to make a big case for integrity in an audience like with you folks here. I lived a good deal of my life as two different people. I was one person over here and one person over here. That lack of congruence is unhealthy. So the idea that a whole person, as a whole person, you're integrated, and people really value that notion of integrity. And then connections, the sense of connectivity. People are inspired by your edge. They're inspired by your vulnerability, by your ability to connect with others. And there's something about your energy that just brings people together. That's what really people talk about when they talk about an authentic person. I call these the spark plugs, if you will, around your own leadership. Your leadership is never done. It's always a matter of building capability. So I take a proactive and purposeful look at leadership and the fact that you want to just every now and then just take a look at and be mindful of those things that enhance connection. You only get one shot at life, folks. And you don't want to end up on the other end of your life wondering or trying to imagine how things might have been different had you brought your perspective sooner and in a bolder way. So I want to end right here by basically saying, be yourself, bring yourself. You only get one shot at this life, and make a big difference when you can. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here with you today.
Harold. Gosh, there's some insights and learnings in there for absolutely everyone, I think, and I love the way that you talk about leadership, not necessarily around management, but leadership across all ages and stages, so I really hope there's something for everyone in there. Now, we have got time for a couple of questions, yes, which is good because we have a couple, using our awesome tech. Harold, I wonder if you could tell us, from your perspective, how do you ensure that your voice is heard if your leaders are trying to turn down your volume or turn you off? Do you, in fact, just move on?
If your leader is trying to turn down perspective and turn down your voice, I think that you need to really, if you're not bringing your perspective, the real question then is, are you adding value? I don't think it's healthy when you have perspective that you then attempt to just sort of contain it to the point where you will struggle. And you will struggle with your conscience in that respect there. You cannot make a difference unless you bring perspective. Perspective is what you were hired for. And if your perspective starts to disturb the peace, then there are ways to be effective in bringing that to the point where you don't want the team to believe that you aren't a part of who they are. So there's one thing to sort of come into a team and to try to save them from themselves, which is not a good way to sort of approach it. And that is, I'm a part of this team, I believe in this team, and I think we can be better. And that's a way to really instill this notion that I come to work each day to make a difference. I make a difference with my voice. If I'm on mute, I can't make a difference. You didn't hire me to put myself on mute. You hired me to bring a perspective. And so that's what I'm doing. Can you help me? I would appeal to most people, most managers, when you ask them directly, are you requiring me to just basically turn my thinking off and become a robot? Most managers would say, no, that's not what I'm requiring at all. If there's a way that I can bring my perspective differently that will make a difference, and help me understand that. But I would suggest to you it's not sustainable if you believe that you can just park your perspective and just walk in to work each day and just go through the processes. You'll be disengaged, and chances are you won't be there in a year's time. It's not sustainable at all. So I think that you owe it to yourself around being engaged to just bring that perspective that you were hired for.
Thank you. And one more, because this really does throw the other side of the perspective on it, and that is, if you are someone who is quite authentic and perhaps a bit outspoken, yes, how do you dial yourself down to allow others to be more authentic and talk up?
Sure thing. It's a calibration that happens. It really is. And so when you have two or more people together in a room, the idea of authenticity, this notion of positivity, and that is being able to affirm what other people bring. Yes, you are authentic. Authentic is being able to bring your perspective and bring it in a way that allows you to feel whole and complete and those types of things. But we also have to make room for others, particularly if we're in a leadership role. So enabling people to get their perspective in, asking people for their perspective, seeking it, calling it out, and also just calibrating around your own impact. It's not, authenticity does not mean that everybody just gets to walk in and just do, whatever they want to do and those types of things. We still have a social order that enables the business to proceed. But do we enable people to actually contribute with their voice, their thinking, and those types of things? You've got to flex in that regard, particularly as a leader.